Hello, my name is Tom Marsh. I'm a professor at the School of Economic Sciences at Washington State University. My talk today is economic modeling of pest and disease events under quarantine. Give you a brief overview. We'll provide some economic motivation, talk about some metrics we use, give you an example one of apple maggot, provide some discussion, room for questions at the end. I provide example 2, pears and fire blight, for your own convenience that you can look at your own time. I will speak briefly to that at the end of the talk. Okay, motivation. Why are we interested in pest and disease outbreaks? They cause disruptions, sometimes serious disruptions to local, regional, and national economies. These disruptions can come at primary supply, where you have impacts on production costs, yield and quality, bearing acreage, and combine that all together, perennial supply response. Also, there can be impacts on international and domestic markets that include trade sanctions and quarantines, which we focus on today, sanitary and phytosanitary costs, as well as tariffs. Sometimes there's also consumer shocks when there are adverse consumer reactions to fruit perceived to be contaminated, for example. Okay, so we can see disruptions both at the supply level, consumer level, and markets along that supply chain. Okay, understanding the impacts from market distortions due to pest and disease are very helpful to policymakers in the fruit industry or other sectors. This helps to understand the heterogeneous impact in terms of consumption, production, value added, trade flow, and the total or individual welfare changes, the economic welfare changes for each of those agents. All as well to understand impacts from changes in regulations, local or national quarantine or interventions. And finally, to understand impacts of response, mitigation, and cleanup activities. All right, for a minute, let's talk about quarantine and international trade. Okay, quarantine measures are put in place to restrict trade in a product where there is a perceived to be a risk from trade in that product, resulting in the transfer of a pest or disease into a country or region free of the pest or disease. The sanitary, phytosanitary, or SPS agreement was established by the WTO to restrict a member country's government's ability to use technical barriers to trade, and in particular quarantine measures, as a means of restricting imports into their country for the protection of domestic producers from foreign competition. A quarantine measure may constitute a trade barrier by acting to restrict the importation of a product on the grounds of sanitary, human or animal, or phytosanitary plant, pest, or disease risk. Okay, so how do economists measure impacts of pest or disease outbreaks? Okay. Economists monetize pest and disease events and interventions. Primary tool we use to assess the consequences of pests and diseases is benefit cost analysis. Under this approach, expected benefits and expected costs are compared to determine the expected net benefits, i.e. the benefit cost ratio, of an event or intervention. So quantifying the likelihood of an outbreak and measuring the magnitudes of consequent costs and benefits are critically important for agencies and organizations. Preparing for uncertain events, planning for interventions, prioritizing resource allocation, or reassessing resource allocations in real time. This last point was particularly important in the 2014-2015 highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak in turkeys and chickens in the US, government officials were able to look at costs of the outbreak and reassess how to allocate resources in real time. All right, so how do we measure these events? So we have these specific measures called consumer surplus and producer surplus, and let me articulate a bit what they mean. So producer surplus is resulting from market retail price fluctuations and reactions after a pest or disease event. So if you have a pest or disease event and prices go up on a product, say apples, then consumers are worse off because they have to pay more. And we'll look at that in more detail in a minute. Prices go down, they may be better off. For producer surplus, this is resulting from cost fluctuations and changes to output price and productivity after a pest or disease event. Again, if the price of apples goes up, producers may be better off, but if they lose a large amount of output due to the pest or disease event, they could be net worse off. All right, now, what we then do is we take consumer surplus, producer surplus, government costs, and other costs. We add them all up together, and we get total economic welfare. So digging a little deeper into these market metrics, if we look at other costs on the left here, this could be cost of transportation or tourism. In the foot and mouth disease outbreak in 2001 in the UK, there was a very large impact on tourism. Allied industries, both vertical and horizontal, and these costs all go to other costs. The costs of the quarantine can be broken down into private costs and public costs. The private costs are embedded in producer surplus, and the public costs are embedded into government costs. That's how we construct or account, or accounting for costs in this approach. Okay, so if you're interested in more details of the economics, I'm going to give you a couple of figures here, and let me talk through first consumer surplus. What we have here on the vertical axis on the left are prices. Horizontal axis are quantity demanded. The demand curve slopes downward, and we have denoted it by demand, and the supply curve slopes upward, and we denote it by S0. So what we're representing here in this case is consumer surplus when we have a price increase. So price is going to increase from P0 to P1 along the vertical axis. And as that increases, then our demand goes from Y0 to Y1. Okay, so when could this occur? This could occur if we have a supply shift. So we have a disease event and yield decreases or quality decreases, so we have less product to the consumer and retailer. So that shifts the supply curve up from S1, from S0 to S1. That decreases yield or product from Y0 to Y1, increases price from P0 to P1. All right, so what does that do to consumers? Because price goes up, consumers are worse off. Our measurement of consumer surplus are these. Initially, the consumer surplus goes from P0 to C to A. Again, it's the triangle, P0 to C to A. After the price increase, it goes from P1 to A to B. Again, that's P1 to A to B. And the most important thing to note is that after the price increase, that triangle P1AB is smaller than P0CA. Okay, so the change in consumer surplus is important, and we'll come back to that as well in a minute. Now we're going to do producer surplus here as well. Here we're going to look at a scenario where we have the same price, no price change, but reduced output. Okay, again, prices along the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis. We're thinking about this event where we have a reduction in supply because of a disease event, and included also is a shift down in demand from D0 to D1 because adverse reaction from consumers. The initial producer surplus is P0, B0, and then after you have a reduction in supply and a reduction in demand, producer surplus is P0, A0. So again, producer surplus after the event is less than producer surplus before the event. All right, so example one here. I'm going to talk about apple maggot. This is a study we did several years back. I'm using it because we were focusing on quarantine costs, and quarantine was a topic of interest for this workshop. Apple maggot infests apples and other fruits, causing a number of problems in the fruit industry. We have decreased fruit quality, yield loss, increased production costs, quarantine costs, and restricted opportunities in domestic and international markets. Those are really opportunity costs. So the durable nature of perennial tree fruits implies stock dynamics as well as invasive species dynamics, and they both play an important role in fruit production and planting. Concern is that sudden shocks to that production system could cause large fluctuations over time in fruit markets. So again, we're talking about stocks, trees, and invasive species that are durable over time, and impacts can be immediate impacts, intermediate impacts, or long-run impacts, and we will demonstrate that as we go through this example. All right, so our modeling objectives here. Because both tree fruit and apple maggot are intertemporal in nature, we develop a dynamic intertemporal partial equilibrium model for a single tree fruit with demand and supply as well as international trade embedded in it. That allows us to calculate changes in producer surplus, consumer surplus, other costs, and government costs. So to estimate the economic consequences of a disease or pest outbreaks in tree fruit and quantify these consumer and producer welfare changes, our intertemporal model is necessary. Okay, so this model is general enough to accommodate other economic shocks as well as tariff changes, etc. Or just to put a perspective on apple production in Washington, the state of Washington dominates apple production in the U.S., about 58% of it in this time period. All right. Geographically, we see up to the left top corner is Washington, and so we're in the northwest corner of the United States, and that's where most of the apple production arises. In Washington, it's a central basin of Washington. It's an irrigated area where most of the apple production occurs. And it's irrigated off primarily the Columbia River irrigation system. Okay, the apple magnet, what is it? It's a major apple pest. It's native to the east coast of North America, Canada, and the US. Infested, untreated orchard could lose 30 to 70% of total production. Okay, the apple maggot in Washington. Apple maggot was first discovered in Washington in 1980. It's established in most counties west of the Cascades, or the western part of the state, by the 1990s. And in 2004, parts of Kittitas and Yakima counties were infested and were quarantined. All right, so I want to talk a little about local quarantine. I mentioned quarantine and international trade. Now I want to talk a little about local quarantine. So why do we do it? So to prevent apple maggots from spreading to other counties in Washington, local authorities relied on early detection and immediate eradication programs. Quarantine areas were established around counties that were known to have apple maggot infestation, and these were monitored by the Washington State Department of Agriculture and local horticultural and pest disease boards. Okay, so production is partitioned into the quarantine region and the non-quarantine regions. Each region has its own set of inventories, production costs, treatment costs, and yields. The share of Washington exports are determined by a price differential to demand effect in each region as a result of the imposed treatment costs for apples to supply effect from the infested region. Okay, some production and trade issues. Chemical control of apple maggot took 3 insecticide sprays per season. Mexico required all apple imports from the U.S. undergo costly cold storage treatment, which is equivalent to a 20 to 30% tariff. Canada requires all apples imported to British Columbia either be certified from an apple maggot free area or undergo cold treatment. All right, so economic model components. So again, we're going to assume a representative grower maximize an infinite stream of discounted expected profits subject to tree stock dynamics and species dynamics and other production constraints. The grower chooses the acreage of removals and new plantings to maximize their expected profit. Using a partial equilibrium framework and assuming a perfectly competitive market, fruit products are sold on the domestic as well as international markets that can be imported or exported. All right, so just thinking about the model in a schematic, let me kind of outline it first. We have production to consumption, and along the supply chain, it can go to fresh use or process use, and consumption come from export from other countries into the U.S. or imported to the U.S. from other countries. And along the right-hand side, we have primary level supply, packer processors, wholesale market, international market, and retail level. Okay, so you can move from production through fresh use or process use into consumption. We also have imports and exports that are built into the model. All right, and then embedded within that as well is the invasive species component. So more formally, if we think about the model structure, we have production decisions, and producers choose the acreages of removals again and new plantings to maximize their expected profit. What we have here in equations are the optimality conditions, the necessary conditions mathematically that determine the trajectory over time. So PV is the present value of acreage aged J trees, RC is removal cost, RM are removals, and NP are plantings. If you're interested in more details, you can see the paper that we present later in the presentation. Okay, so we have to keep track of both tree, fruit dynamics and invasive species dynamics. First, let's just focus on tree fruit. And here what we do is an inventory differentiated by age or a cohort effect. And so the first part of this is really capturing a cohort effect. In K sub TJ is acreage of age J trees in time T. And so we track these period by period, and then we're able to also use that expression to get our total fruit production per year, and that's FP sub T. Next, we have the invasive species component. And this is a population front advance model. It's determined by the equation presented here. C is a colonization rate, N naught's the initial number of individuals in a colony, K is carrying capacity, R is the rate of population increase, V is a relative speed of population spread. Remember V, we're going to use that representation later on. We could have chosen other models to try to represent the spread of apple maggot. This was our choice, and we calibrated this model to historical data. Okay, so the population front of a pest species advances linearly at a constant speed in this model. Assumptions about apple production. Okay, so we assume there form 3 regions in Washington. We have an infested region in Washington and a non-infested region. And then we have the 3rd region, which is the rest of the US. In Washington, new plantings of apple are almost all high density. So we have 2 production systems, high density plantings in Washington, and we're going to assume low density plantings in the rest of the US. We assume increasing production costs. A 1% increase in total production leads to a 1% increase in production cost. Supply of rootstock is assumed to have a cost of elasticity of 2. That means a 1% increase in new plantings results in a 2% increase in cost. Apple acreage, orchard acreage by age is not available. We have inventories from Washington, and they were estimated from the Washington 2001 Tree Fruit Survey and 2002 Agricultural Census data. Inventory for the rest of the US are total acreage divided by an assumed maximum orchard life of 35 years. Pest control is $45 per acre, assuming 3 sprays, each costing $15 per acre. So some interesting aspects of apple markets. Export and import demand models for major trading partners were estimated using data from the World Trade Atlas. That is, we specified export and import demand models and did econometric estimation on them. So we have specific models for our major trading partners. Domestic demand at Farmgate was estimating using data obtained from the Free Fruit and Tree Nut Yearbook. 2004, cost of exporting to Canada increased by 30% relative to the farm level price for fresh apples. Okay, so the model was calculated for 2002 in this case, using agricultural census data. Specified as a discrete time optimal control model and solved as a mixed complementarity model in GAMS. Initial result is that if apple maggot continues to spread at a historical speed, all apple production in Washington would be infested in 34 years. What we show here are dynamic price responses to apple maggot spread. The black line is there's no spread. The blue line is historical speed of advance. That's what we observe now in the speed of advance of apple maggot through Washington. And the red line is 1/5 the speed. So the cyclical nature of this price response is inherent to the artifacts of the model. We could spend more time on it, but perhaps more useful would be to look at measures of economic welfare. Here again, we have a cyclical response in some of these. It's inherent in the artifacts of the model. Let me point out what's going out in general and then be a little more specific. First, what's really going on here is you have apple maggot spread going on in Washington. In the infested areas, that spread increases costs of production. Markets adjust in Washington, that increases the price of apples. So you have also in this that apple maggot is decreasing yield and quality of apples. So you have a negative supply response and you have prices going up. Prices are going up, so if you look at the red line, consumer surplus is negative in almost all cases. Again, if the price of apples goes up, you as a consumer are worse off because you have to pay more. That's why you see a negative consumer surplus. Producer surplus, the well-being of the growers in Washington, is green. It's also negative. It's negative again. Why? Well, even though there's a slight price increase, the problem is that you lose production and yield. You have yield losses and quality losses in Washington. So you observe a negative producer surplus. The blue line is producers in other parts of the U.S. outside of Washington. That's positive a little bit because they are compensating for the problems in Washington, and they're receiving a little higher price for their product. Total welfare is in black, and so that is on the bottom, and we can see that's negative. To be a little more precise in total, let's just look at some numbers. So what do we have here? Here's some values. These are all in US dollars, millions of US dollars. The first column is the speed of the spread. So the historical spread, we have it in red here, and the total welfare loss of that is minus $14.76 million. Now, what happens if we decrease the speed of the spread? So that's the first column. So we go from 0.9 all the way down to 0.2 V. Again, V is the historical speed of apple maggot spread. So as we see the total welfare loss, as the spread slows down, as we go down that column, decreases. It's a second column. The third column is the benefits and control of quarantine. As there's more quarantine and the spread of apple maggot is slowing down, you see the benefits to control and quarantine increase. And then the right is the break, the furthest column on the right is the break-even annual spending associated with the benefit cost analysis. Okay, so as we're reducing the spread, that implies that we see a mitigation or a reduction in the economic loss, an increase in benefits to control and quarantine. Now, if we had a different model of spread of apple maggot, we would likely see different results. They wouldn't look exactly the same, but perhaps in general, we would see that, again, if you reduce the spread, then you mitigate the economic loss and you increase the benefits to control and quarantine. All right, so just three kind of general comments related to this research. It's important to point out that short-term price impacts are less volatile than short-term welfare impacts. The lack of price response in the short term does not necessarily mean a government policy is effective or ineffective. Because tree fruit have such a long period of going from initial planting to production, as well as it's durable over time, you have to think about intertemporal impacts. You have an immediate impact, you have an intermediate impact, and you can have a long-term impact. So you have to think about all of these three in a dynamic context. Okay, so over time, slowing the spread of an apple maggot does pay for both the producer and consumer, and we see that distinctly in our metrics that we measure under cost-benefit analysis. Okay, so there are other economic issues that come into quarantine, and I just want to, mention them. We've run into these issues when looking at other commodities and other issues. So the topic of business continuity is important. If sectors or regions of a country are prepared to enable business continuity through an event, a pest or disease event or a disaster, then that can change the impacts of quarantine. We have not talked about risk aversion, how individual growers, producers, processors, consumers will respond to risk aversion. If they're very risk averse, less risk averse, that's an important issue. As well, asymmetry of information can drive different outcomes. So if the producer knows that he has a lower quality product, but down the supply chain, the processor or the fresh packer doesn't, then we can have some market disruptions and negative spillover effects down the supply chain. Okay, supply chains. This is very important. In countries or regions where there are endemic disease issues, they may have dedicated or vertical channels in the supply chain to deal with products coming from an infested region or products that are damaged. And so these can actually be very beneficial in terms of moving product, in times of disease outbreaks or pest outbreaks. Finally, we also do in some of our modeling stochastic simulations. What I've presented so far are point estimates of what our metrics of benefits and costs are. It's often of interest to know confidence intervals about these values or estimates of benefits and costs. And so we've done stochastic simulations to try to get a better idea of what the ranges and statistical significance potentially some of these outcomes. Other economic issues, market power can make a difference. If you have a single processor or packer, that can make a difference in outcomes in a disease event. If we think about commodity-based trade, and what we mean here is that we try to trade based on the product itself as opposed to the region from which the product is sourced. So is there a way to trade a product that comes from an infested area but is not affected or contaminated in the domestic or international markets, so that we don't lose so much of its value? So maybe it's an uncontaminated product, but it simply comes from an infested region. Typically that would be really marked down, but that's a loss of welfare. It's an inefficiency in the markets. So if we could trade just based on the commodity, that may provide a preferred outcome. And this is a big discussion in foot and mouth disease trade issues related to livestock. Okay, regionalization and trade agreements can make a big difference. Political economy and trade negotiations as well, whether there's a black market or not to move product, or if there's environmental spillovers from these events that could be large and need to be accounted for. So those are just some of the other issues that one could potentially think about in modeling quarantines. Okay, questions? Here are some selected references that you can use as a resource. And within those papers, there are other references that may be very useful for you. This is just some of the work we've completed in the past. Now I have an example 2 on pair models. I'm not going to go through this, but let me just outline it. We do work on pair modeling in the US. This is again a structural economic model using equilibrium displacement. In this case, though, we do not embed or integrate invasive species model. Here we're simply treating diseases as economic shocks to the structural system. We still include investment into pair acreage, as well as embed domestic and international markets and supply chains. But in this case, the invasive species was treated as an economic shock. Thank you very much for listening. Have a good day.